There's a question that most people think about in private, and almost nobody asks out loud because asking it out loud sounds either lazy or radical, and the modern economy has very efficient mechanisms for making both of those seem like personal failures. The question is this: why, after 2.5 centuries of industrialization, after productivity increases, that would have seemed miraculous to any previous generation of human beings, after the invention of machines that can do in an hour what once took a week, why is everyone still so busy? Why is there still not enough? Why does it feel to so many people in the wealthiest societies in human history like one missed paycheck separates them from catastrophe? The answer is not a mystery. It is not bad luck or human nature or the inevitable complexity of modern life. It is a design, not a conspiracy. Conspiracies require coordination, secrecy, and a level of human organization that history suggests is not really available. But a design nonetheless, a set of interlocking structural choices made over centuries that have built an economic system whose primary output is not prosperity or happiness or freedom, but motion. Continuous, exhausting, economically necessary motion. The hamster wheel is not a metaphor. It is an engineering achievement. This is the story of how it was built, why it works so well, and what it is designed to prevent you from having enough time to notice. In 1930, the economist John Maynard Keynes, the most influential economist of the 20th century, a man whose ideas shaped the post-war Western world more than almost any other single thinker, wrote an essay called Economic Possibilities for Our Grandchildren. He was looking forward from the vantage point of 1930 toward the world of 2030. His prediction was specific. By 2030, he argued, the standard of living in the Western world would be 4 to 8 times higher than in 1930 due to technological progress and capital accumulation. This prediction was, if anything, conservative. It has proven roughly correct. He then made a second prediction, which has proven spectacularly embarrassingly wrong. Keynes predicted that by 2030, the primary economic problem facing Western societies would not be how to produce enough, but how to manage an abundance of leisure. He predicted the 15-hour work week. He thought the pressing question of the early 21st century would be what people would do with all the time that technology had freed up. He worried earnestly about the psychological difficulties of a species that had organized itself around labor, suddenly finding itself with vast unstructured time. He was describing what should have happened. The productivity increases, he predicted, arrived. The 15-hour work week did not. Americans in the 2020s work more hours per year than they did in the 1970s. They work more hours per year than workers in almost every other wealthy nation. They retire later. They take fewer vacation days. They sleep less. They report higher rates of work-related stress and burnout than any previous measured generation. The productivity gains came, the leisure did not. The obvious question is, where did the gains go? The most straightforward answer, the one that most directly explains the divergence between productivity growth and wage growth, is that the productivity gains went to capital rather than labor. From roughly 1948 to 1973, productivity and wages in the United States rose together in near perfect parallel. When American workers produced more, American workers earned more. The relationship was not perfect, but it was real and consistent enough that it formed the material basis for the post-war American dream. Each generation would be meaningfully better off than the last, not because of luck or exceptional talent, but simply because the economy was structured to share its gains with the people who did the work. In 1973, this relationship broke. Productivity continued to grow, more slowly than before, but consistently. Wages, adjusted for inflation, essentially stopped growing for the median worker. They have remained, in real terms, roughly flat for 50 years. The gains since 1973 have gone somewhere. The economy is roughly 3 times as productive as it was then, but they have gone to the owners of capital rather than the suppliers of labor. The share of national income going to workers has fallen consistently for 5 decades. The share going to profits and capital returns has risen. This is not ideology, it is measurement. The data is public. The graphs are available to anyone who looks at them. The divergence between productivity and compensation is one of the most clearly documented economic facts of the late 20th century. What it means for the person who works for a living is this: you are producing significantly more value than you were 50 years ago, and you're capturing a smaller and smaller fraction of that value. The machine has become more powerful. You are running faster. You're keeping less of the energy you generate. But there is a second answer to the question of where the gains went, and this one is more insidious because it operates not through exploitation, but through desire. Not by taking from you, but by teaching you to want things you didn't want before, in quantities and at frequencies that require permanent, full-time income to sustain. In 1899, the sociologist Thorstein Veblen published The Theory of the Leisure Class, in which he introduced the concept of conspicuous consumption, the purchase and display of goods not for their functional value, but for the social signal they send. Buying an expensive item in Veblen's analysis was not primarily about wanting the item. It was about communicating status, belonging, aspiration. It was social rather than material. Veblen was describing something that had always existed, but had, in the industrial age, been given an engine. Because in the industrial age, for the first time, the production of goods exceeded the basic needs of the population that could afford them. Factories could make more stuff than people who needed stuff could buy. The economic problem of the 20th century was not, as previous centuries' problems had been, how to produce enough. It was how to sell enough, how to keep consumption at a pace that justified continued production. The solution to this problem is one of the great unacknowledged achievements of the 20th century. It is called advertising. But advertising, in the full scope of what it became, is much more than the placing of messages in newspapers or on television screens. It is the systematic engineering of human desire, the creation, at industrial scale, of wants that did not previously exist, and the continuous upgrading of those wants so that what satisfied them last year no longer satisfies them this year. Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud, the man who essentially invented modern public relations, understood this with crystalline clarity in the 1920s. His insight was that Freud's discoveries about unconscious desire could be weaponized commercially. People did not need to be told that they needed something. They needed to be made to feel that they needed it, at a level below rational deliberation. His campaigns were masterpieces of this art. He convinced American women to smoke cigarettes in public by connecting cigarettes to women's suffrage and personal liberation. He turned bacon and eggs from an occasional meal to the standard American breakfast by commissioning a physician's survey that declared heavy breakfasts healthy. He did not sell products. He redesigned the emotional landscape in which products were encountered. Bernays was the pioneer. The industry he created has, in the century since, deployed the resources of psychology, neuroscience, sociology, and data science to pursue the same goal with instruments of incomparably greater sophistication. In 1924, the major light bulb manufacturers of the world, General Electric, Philips, Osram, and several others, met in Geneva and formed a cartel called the Phoebus Cartel. They had a problem. Their light bulbs lasted too long. Engineers had developed bulbs that could burn for 2,500 hours or more. The cartel's solution was to collectively limit bulb life to 1,000 hours. Not because 1,000 hours was technically optimal, because a bulb that dies sooner must be replaced sooner, and a bulb that must be replaced sooner generates more revenue. This is the foundational act of planned obsolescence, the deliberate engineering of products to fail or to feel obsolete on a schedule that maximizes replacement purchases. The Phoebus Cartel's light bulb agreement was exposed and eventually dismantled. The principle it embodied was not. In the 1950s, General Motors design chief Harley Earl developed the concept of the annual model change, the practice of introducing cosmetically updated car models each year, not because the engineering required it, but because last year's model needed to feel dated. This is aesthetic obsolescence. The product doesn't stop working, but it begins to feel wrong, unfashionable, insufficient. The desire for replacement is manufactured not through mechanical failure, but through cultural engineering. The iPhone annual update cycle is the direct descendant of Harley Earl's annual model change. The phone works, it will work for 5 more years. But the software updates will slow, and the camera will feel inadequate compared to the new version, and the social signal sent by an older model will change, and the ecosystem of accessories and integrations will drift toward incompatibility. The obsolescence is partly technical, partly social, partly psychological, but it is never accidental. It is managed. The economy requires this, not in a conspiratorial sense, but in a structural one. An economy organized around continuous growth requires continuous consumption. Continuous consumption requires continuous replacement. Continuous replacement requires that what you already own should, on a reliable schedule, become inadequate. The machine cannot stop. Therefore, the products must keep dying. The final piece of the manufactured scarcity engine is credit, the system that allows desire to be acted upon before the income to support it has been earned. Before consumer credit became widely available, before credit cards in the 1950s and 60s, before the democratization of mortgage lending, before the normalization of financing for everything from furniture to medical bills, the natural limit on consumption was income. You could only buy what you had saved. This was economically inefficient in the sense that desire often outpaced income, leaving consumer wants unmet. From the perspective of producers who needed to sell goods, this was a problem. Credit solved the problem by decoupling the timing of desire from the timing of income. You want the car now, you don't have the money now, the bank lends you the money now, and you repay it over 5 years with interest. The car is sold, the bank earns interest, the manufacturer's factory continues running. The worker who might otherwise have saved for 3 years and bought the car in cash instead buys it immediately, pays significantly more for it in total interest, and remains obligated to continuous employment for the duration of the loan. This is the key mechanism. Consumer credit does not merely allow people to buy things they couldn't otherwise afford. It obligates them to continued participation in the economy at a level sufficient to service the debt. The mortgage commits you to 30 years of employment income at a level sufficient to make the monthly payment. The car loan commits you to 5 years. The student loan commits you to 20. The credit card balance, which for the median American cardholder never fully reaches zero, commits you to permanent, continuous, full-time employment in perpetuity. The debt is not an unfortunate side effect of credit. The debt is the product. The continuous obligation to employment is not a bug, it is the feature. An economy whose participants are all deeply indebted is an economy whose participants cannot afford to stop, cannot afford to strike, cannot afford to take risks, cannot afford to say no to unreasonable demands from employers, cannot afford to wait for better offers, cannot afford, in the most literal sense, to slow down. The wheel turns because the people on it cannot stop running. The design of mass public education in the industrializing world was not, at its origins, primarily about literacy or critical thinking, or the transmission of civilization's accumulated knowledge. It was about workforce preparation. The Prussian education model, which was adopted, with modifications, by the United States and most of the Western world in the 19th century, was explicitly designed around the requirements of an industrial economy and a military state. It required students to arrive at a fixed time, sit in assigned places, attend to a single authority figure, move between activities at a bell's command, perform tasks on schedule rather than at their own pace, and accept evaluation by external standards they did not set. These are not primarily the skills of a free and curious intellect. They are the skills of a reliable factory worker and a disciplined soldier. The scheduling of the school day mirrors the scheduling of the factory shift. The evaluation system, grades, rankings, performance reviews, mirrors the performance management systems of employment. The social structure of the classroom, authority concentrated at the front, compliance rewarded, disruption punished, mirrors the hierarchical structure of most workplaces. Children spend 12 years practicing in advance the specific behavioral patterns that employment will require of them. This is not a hidden conspiracy. It was stated openly by the people who designed these systems. Woodrow Wilson, before he was president, was the president of Princeton University, and in a 1909 speech he said with disarming clarity, "We want one class of persons to have a liberal education, and we want another class of persons, a very much larger class of necessity in every society, to forego the privilege of a liberal education and fit themselves to perform specific, difficult manual tasks." The education system was designed to sort people into roles. Most roles were roles in someone else's enterprise, requiring the skills of reliable participation rather than independent thought. What education does not teach, systematically, structurally, with very few exceptions, is the financial architecture of the economy that graduates will enter. How compound interest works, how to read a mortgage contract, what a marginal tax rate means, how equity accumulates, how to evaluate a salary offer against a benefits package, how to think about career decisions in terms of lifetime wealth rather than monthly income, how to distinguish between spending that builds towards something and spending that extracts value from your future. These are not obscure technical topics. They are the operational knowledge required to navigate the economy without being systematically disadvantaged by the ignorance of it. They are not taught because an economy whose participants understand its mechanics might produce participants who make different choices, choices that serve their interests rather than the interests of the institutions whose products and services they are being trained from childhood to consume. In 1957, a Canadian economist named John Kenneth Galbraith published The Affluent Society, in which he observed something that struck him as peculiar. The United States was the wealthiest society in human history, and a very large proportion of its citizens were in a state of chronic financial anxiety. Not poverty, chronic anxiety. The persistent background sense that what they had was insufficient, that what they needed was just slightly beyond their current reach, that the next paycheck mattered enormously. Galbraith called this the dependence effect. The idea that in a truly abundant society, the wants that drive consumption can no longer be natural or spontaneous, because natural and spontaneous wants are finite and would, in a sufficiently productive economy, be satisfied. The wants must therefore be manufactured, continuously, inventively, at a scale matching the economy's productive capacity. And manufacturing wants requires manufacturing the sense that their absence represents insufficiency, inadequacy, even danger. The media environment in which modern people live is, in this sense, one of the primary mechanisms for manufacturing the anxiety that drives economic participation. Not primarily through advertising, though advertising remains central, but through the entire architecture of information consumption. Financial news, which has become a constant ambient background for anyone with a smartphone and a passing interest in the economy, is structured around threat. The market is up, which means there is fear of correction. The market is down, which means there is fear of further decline. Inflation is rising, which means your savings are eroding. Inflation is falling, which means the economy might be weakening. Interest rates are high, which means borrowing is expensive. Interest rates are low, which means savings earn nothing. The housing market is hot, which means you're being priced out. The housing market is cooling, which means the value of your assets is falling. Every configuration of the economy is presented as a different species of danger. This is not a distortion of financial reality. Financial reality genuinely involves risk and uncertainty. But the presentation of that reality, continuous, real-time, maximally emotionally salient, structured around narrative tension and the imperative to act, serves a very specific economic function. It keeps people engaged with the financial system. It keeps them checking their portfolios, reading their account balances, comparing their situations to benchmarks of sufficiency that are always being moved slightly upward. It produces a state of continuous low-level economic anxiety that is, for the financial industry, enormously profitable. Anxious people buy insurance. Anxious people pay for financial advice. Anxious people refinance their mortgages. Anxious people pay for premium memberships and extended warranties and identity protection services and all the other products that are, at bottom, products sold to manage the anxiety that the information environment continuously generates. The anxiety is the product. The fear is the engine. In most wealthy countries, the link between employment and healthcare is either non-existent or weak. In the United States, it is nearly absolute. Approximately 160 million Americans receive their health insurance through their employer or a family member's employer. For these people, the loss of employment means not merely the loss of income, but the loss of access to health care, an access that, given American healthcare costs, is not a luxury but a life and death matter. A single serious illness without insurance can generate medical bills of $100,000 or more. Medical debt is the leading cause of personal bankruptcy in the United States, a distinction that it holds uniquely among wealthy nations. The practical consequence of this link is that employment is not merely economically necessary for American workers. It is physically necessary in a way that it is not for workers in countries with universal health care. An American worker who is dissatisfied with their job, who believes they are underpaid or mistreated or working in an environment that is damaging to their health and well-being, faces a calculation that their counterpart in Germany or Canada or France does not face. If I leave, I lose my insurance. If something happens to me or my family in the window before I find new insurance, the cost could be catastrophic. This is not a circumstance that arose accidentally. The employer-based health insurance system emerged in the 1940s and was subsequently protected and extended by policy choices that reflected the interests of employers who found that providing health care created employee dependency and reduced turnover. An employee who cannot afford to lose their insurance is an employee who cannot afford to organize, cannot afford to demand better conditions, cannot afford to walk out. The wheel turns partly because the brakes have been removed. In 1926, Henry Ford reduced the working week at Ford Motor Company from 6 days to 5. This was not a philanthropic gesture. Ford had done the research. He found that workers who worked 5 days produced more, in total, than workers who worked 6, because the 6th day produced fatigued, error-prone, resentful labor that was less valuable than the rest it replaced. Ford's 5-day week was adopted widely, and within a generation it had become the standard across the American economy. The 8-hour day, which labor movements had fought for across the preceding century, combined with the 5-day week to produce the 40-hour standard. This standard has not changed in 90 years. In those 90 years, productivity has approximately tripled. The economy produces 3 times as much output per hour of labor as it did when the 40-hour week became standard. By the logic of Ford's original experiment, by the logic of Keynes's 1930 prediction, the work week should have continued to fall. 30 hours, 25, 20. The productivity gains should have purchased leisure. They did not, and the reason they did not is not technological or natural. It is political and structural. The gains were captured by capital. The hours were maintained, and in many sectors extended, because a working class with abundant leisure time is a working class with time to think, to organize, to question, to develop alternatives. A working class that is tired is a working class that comes home and consumes. Tired people watch television. Tired people order delivery. Tired people do not attend city council meetings or read the terms of their mortgage contracts or research their retirement funds fee structures. Exhaustion is politically functional. Rest is politically dangerous. Not in the sense of physical danger, but in the sense of creating the conditions in which people evaluate their circumstances clearly and ask whether different arrangements might be possible. The 40-hour week was not a ceiling that productivity could not breach. It was a floor that was politically convenient to maintain. The Nordics, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, are not utopias. They have problems, inequalities, social tensions, political conflicts, But they represent a genuine experiment in organizing an advanced capitalist economy differently, and the results of that experiment are worth examining without either idealization or dismissal. In Denmark, the standard work year involves roughly 1,180 hours of paid labor, compared to approximately 1,800 in the United States. Danish workers take more vacation, work shorter hours, and retire at comparable or earlier ages. Danish productivity per hour worked is comparable to American productivity. The Danish economy is not less functional for the reduced hours. It is, by most measures of human welfare, more functional. The mechanism that makes this possible is, at its core, a political one. A different settlement between capital and labor, backed by strong unions, enforced by law, and sustained by a social contract that provides healthcare, childcare, education, and retirement security as public goods, rather than as employer benefits or individual purchases. When the basic necessities of life do not depend on continuous full-time employment, the employment relationship becomes less desperate. Less desperate workers have more bargaining power. More bargaining power produces better conditions. Better conditions produce a workforce that is more functional, not less. This is not a secret. It is not a recent discovery. It has been measured and documented and analyzed for decades. The reason it has not been adopted in the United States is not that it doesn't work. It is that the people who benefit from the current arrangement, who benefit specifically from labor markets in which workers are too economically precarious to demand better terms, have sufficient political power to prevent the changes that would end their advantage. The wheel keeps turning because the people who own the wheel prefer it in motion. In 1971, the economist Herbert Simon observed that in a world of abundant information, the scarce resource is not information, but attention. A wealth of information creates a poverty of attention, he wrote, in a sentence that was prescient beyond anything he could have known in 1971. The digital economy of the 21st century is built, at its base layer, on the monetization of human attention. The products of the attention economy, social media platforms, streaming services, news aggregators, mobile games, are not primarily in the business of providing entertainment or information or connection, though they do provide these things. They are primarily in the business of capturing attention and converting it into advertising revenue or subscription fees. The engineering that goes into capturing and holding attention is serious. The companies that do it employ teams of neuroscientists, behavioral psychologists, and data scientists whose specific job is to understand the mechanisms of human attention and engagement and to design products that exploit those mechanisms as effectively as possible. Variable reward schedules, the same psychological mechanism that makes slot machines addictive, underlie the infinite scroll in the notification system. Social validation loops, the primitive human need for social approval, underlie the like button and the follower count. Fear of missing out, one of the most powerful motivators in social animals, underlies the real-time feed that must be checked constantly lest something important pass unnoticed. The practical consequence is that the average American spends approximately 7 hours per day looking at screens. Some of this is productive. Much of it is not. A significant fraction of it is the consumption of content that produces no lasting satisfaction, creates no skills, builds no relationships, and generates no independent thought. Content whose primary economic function is to generate advertising impressions and to maintain the engagement that makes those impressions possible. The time that Keynes imagined would be spent in leisure, in the cultivation of art and friendship and philosophy, and the long, unstructured thinking that produces genuine insight, has in large part been colonized. Not by work, but by a form of consumption that feels like rest and functions like a second shift of economic activity. You're not being paid to scroll, but someone is being paid because you scroll. Your attention, your time, your neurological engagement, these are the product being sold. You are the raw material. The leisure that technology was supposed to create has been filled by a new kind of labor, unpaid, invisible, and engineered to feel like pleasure. The machine found another gear. The word enough is, in the modern economy, almost unspeakable. It is the economic equivalent of profanity, not because it is offensive, but because it is structurally threatening. An economy organized around continuous growth cannot accommodate the concept of enough, because enough implies a ceiling, and a ceiling implies the possibility of stopping. And stopping implies that the wheel might slow down. The GDP, the measure by which modern economies are primarily evaluated, does not measure satisfaction, health, leisure, relationships, environmental sustainability, or any of the things that people actually value when asked directly. It measures transactions. Every transaction adds to GDP, whether it produces something useful or repairs something harmful. Traffic jams add to GDP because they consume fuel. Divorce adds to GDP because it generates legal fees. Illness adds to GDP because it generates medical expenditure. The ceaseless activity of a society in which everyone is always working, always spending, always servicing debt, always replacing and upgrading and subscribing. This is, by the GDP measure, the ideal economic state. The things that do not add to GDP: cooking at home instead of ordering delivery, repairing rather than replacing, growing vegetables, walking instead of driving, sleeping a full 8 hours, spending the afternoon reading a book that you own, talking with a friend instead of watching something. These activities are, in the classical economic sense, unproductive. They generate no transactions. They cannot be measured. They contribute nothing to the growth that the system requires. They are also, in every human sense that actually matters, the things that make life worth living. This is the final and most elegant mechanism of the system's self-perpetuation. It has defined productivity and leisure in terms that make the activities supporting human well-being appear to be economically worthless, and the activities that sustain the machine appear to be the measure of a life well lived. The busy person is successful. The quiet person is idle. The consumer is participating. The one who has decided they have enough is dropping out. The language of the economy is not neutral. It encodes a value system, and the value system it encodes is the one that keeps the wheel turning.